The chimes of the antique grandfather clock echoed 9 times through the hallway of courtroom 7, each heavy tone stretching time itself within the solemn air of the Jefferson County Courthouse. Under the soft golden glow cast by the chandelier above, Judge Richard Harmon slowly adjusted the black robe and gold-rimmed glasses that had been with him for over 2 decades. At 58, Harmon was a symbol of discipline and unyielding law, a man for whom justice left no room for compassion. Next case, he called out, cold and resolute. His voice rang through the wood-paneled courtroom, drawing the attention of everyone present. Case number 476302, the State versus Charles Wilson, charged with third-degree trespassing. The courtroom doors creaked open slowly, and all eyes turned toward the man entering. A faint murmur rippled through the audience as Charles Wilson stepped forward, his gait unsteady, shoulders hunched beneath a faded checkered shirt, old jeans frayed at the cuffs and worn-out work boots. Tufts of white hair stuck out from under a faded baseball cap, which he respectfully removed as he approached the defendant's table. Judge Harmon squinted as he observed, his gaze filled with the familiar disdain of a man who had seen too many like Charles. Poor, invisible to society, and convinced that old memories could somehow justify wrongdoing. "Mr. Wilson," the judge began, his tone laced with weariness and irritation. "The report states that you were caught trespassing on private property at Clearwater. Do you have any explanation for your actions?" Charles looked up. His blue eyes were startlingly clear, sharp and present, unaffected by age. "Your Honor, I was simply sitting by the lake. I used to fish there as a child. It was once a peaceful place for me." The judge flipped through the file with exaggerated annoyance. "This is your second offense within the past 6 months. The previous incident was at the Westbrook Country Club." "That's correct, sir," Charles answered without hesitation. "They have a beautiful garden there." A few soft chuckles rose from the gallery but were quickly silenced by a sharp glance from the judge. Leaning forward, Harmon's voice dropped, now tinged with threat. "Do you find this funny, Mr. Wilson? Because this court certainly does not." Charles stood calmly, hands folded in front of him, with a quiet dignity that unsettled the judge. He wasn't used to seeing defendants so composed, so unmoved. "Where's your lawyer?" Harmon asked, scanning the courtroom. "I don't have one," Charles replied. "Of course." The judge sneered. "Let me guess. You couldn't afford one." "No, I chose not to hire an attorney for today's hearing," Charles said firmly, though softly. Harmon raised an eyebrow. "You chose not to? Do you even understand the charges against you? A repeat offense could land you in jail." "I understand the law quite well, Your Honor." The room shifted ever so slightly, an uneasy stillness falling over it, as if something wasn't adding up. Harmon clenched his jaw, his irritation growing. "If you understand the law so well, why do you keep breaking it?" Charles paused, letting the silence linger before answering. It was not a pause for effect, but one for reflection. "I didn't think I was hurting anyone, sir," he finally replied, his voice sincere enough to slow the pace of the moment. A surprising wave of emotion rippled through the observers, not because the old man raised his voice, but because he hadn't. He was so human. "The law isn't a menu, Mr. Wilson," Harmon growled. "You don't get to pick what parts you follow based on how you feel." At the prosecution's table, Assistant District Attorney Melissa Chin, who had been quietly arranging documents, furrowed her brow. The emotional tone in the courtroom had shifted, and she wasn't sure she felt justice being served anymore. "So, tell me, Mr. Wilson," Harmon leaned back, his voice adopting a sarcastic tone. "What do you do for a living, or have you retired and now spend your days trespassing for fun?" "I keep myself busy with the things I care about," Charles replied. "Things you care about? Like invading private property and wasting the court's time?" The judge shot back. "I apologize if I caused any inconvenience, Your Honor," Charles said, his voice calm as his gaze drifted to a space far beyond the walls of the courtroom. perhaps to a place long gone, but still vivid in his mind. "Do you understand?" Harmon's voice suddenly spiked, louder now, echoing against the cold walls of the courtroom. "Even processing a minor case like yours costs taxpayers thousands of dollars, money that should go toward fixing roads, improving schools, or funding public services. But instead, we have to waste time on people like you, people who refuse to follow the basic rules that keep society functioning." Charles remained motionless. He didn't flinch, didn't frown, didn't defend. His stillness only agitated the judge further. He was not accustomed to being challenged by a man so seemingly insignificant. "I have to wonder," Harmon continued, now more mocking than angry, "why someone your age is still doing this. Are you bored? Do you think you're special? Or are you just desperate for attention no one gives you anymore at the nursing home?" From the gallery, a young public defender, newly assigned, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her expression tightened at the way the elderly man was being berated. This wasn't justice. It was something else. "Your Honor," Charles began, but Harmon cut him off with a dismissive wave. "I've heard it all before, Mr. Wilson. Don't waste my time." The judge once again adjusted his glasses, a gesture the regulars recognized as a prelude to one of his infamous moral lectures. "When I was growing up, men of your generation taught us about responsibility, hard work, and respect for the law," Harmon declared, his voice rising as if addressing not just Charles, but the whole of society. "And now, here you are, standing in front of me in tattered clothes, as if you've forgotten every lesson you once preached." Charles said nothing, but anyone watching closely might have noticed a faint twinkle in his eye, as if he remembered something the judge did not. "Look at yourself," Harmon exclaimed, gesturing dismissively. "Is this really how you want to be seen? There are organizations out there, shelters, programs, resources for people like you. Yet here you are, standing in court with worn-out shoes and a threadbare shirt." Hush swept across the room. Some exchanged uncertain glances. Even the court reporter paused, fingers hovering above the keyboard. Charles finally spoke again, quiet but clear. "Your Honor, you assume far too much about me." "Not assumptions," Harmon shot back immediately. "Observations. And based on what I see, you're someone who's made a series of poor decisions and now expects society to excuse them." From the prosecution table, Attorney Chin furrowed her brow, preparing to interject. "Your Honor, if I may." "Calm moment, Counselor." Harmon raised his hand, eyes still locked on Charles. "I'm not finished with him." Charles remained standing, his back straight, gaze steady, as if he were the only person in the courtroom untouched by the emotional storm the judge was stirring. "You know something, Mr. Wilson," Harmon continued, his voice drifting into a moralizing tone. "This court sees real hardship every day, people who've made mistakes but are trying to make things right. And then there are people like you, who seem to take pleasure in being a nuisance to society." In the corner of the room, seasoned court officer Rodriguez, who had witnessed countless hearings, kept a neutral expression, but his eyes betrayed growing discomfort. Something about the direction this proceeding was taking didn't sit right with him. "I'm not proud of breaking the law, Your Honor," Charles said, his voice still unnervingly calm. "Not proud?" Harmon leaned back in his chair. "Then explain to me why you're repeating the same offense. Why not just go to a public park? Are those not good enough for you?" Charles took a deep breath. The words he spoke next weren't an excuse. They were a piece of his past, a fragment of memory that had shaped the man he had become. "Clearwater isn't just private land, sir," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "My father used to be the groundskeeper there. Every Sunday he'd take me to fish by the lake. We weren't wealthy, but those moments, they were my entire world." The room fell into silence. For a split second, something shifted in Judge Harmon's stern face. Perhaps recognition or something close to it, but it quickly vanished, replaced by his usual rigidity. Nostalgia is not a legal defense, Mr. Wilson, he said, but this time his voice had softened, if only slightly. Enough for others to notice. I understand. Charles nodded. His eyes no longer looked at Harmon directly, but somewhere beyond him, as if seeing the image of a father smiling by the lakeside on a long-forgotten spring afternoon. Mr. Wilson, it's clear you don't understand what I'm trying to say, Judge Harmon said, each word sharpened like a freshly honed blade. Maybe a harsher sentence will help the message sink in. He flipped through the file once more, muttering under his breath about repeat offenders and the burden they placed on the court. Given your history of prior violations and your apparent lack of remorse, he said, raising his head, voice steely, I intend to sentence you to 30 days in the county jail. Perhaps that time will give you the opportunity to reflect on your behavior and to learn to respect the property rights of others. A ripple of shock ran through the courtroom. From the prosecutor's table to the public gallery, even Assistant District Attorney Melissa looked stunned. She rose to speak, her voice polite but concerned. Your Honor, the prosecution was prepared to recommend community service considering the nonviolent nature of the offense and the defendant's age. Judge Harmon cast her a cold glance, cutting her off with icy precision. Thank you for your input, counselor, but last I checked, I'm still the one wearing the robe in this courtroom. Then, in the tense silence that followed, the seemingly frail old man who had remained quiet until now finally showed a flicker of emotion. But it wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something else. A glimmer of surprise, perhaps even amusement, like a man watching a play edge toward its climax while knowing a twist was coming that no one else could see. Your Honor, he said, his voice suddenly firmer than ever before. Before you pass judgment, may I request permission to make a phone call? I'd like to inform my daughter. She should know if I'm going to spend 30 days in jail, Armand scoffed. A phone call? This isn't a crime drama, Mr. Wilson. You should have made any calls before showing up here. It'll take just a minute, Charles replied, calm and respectful. My daughter needs to know, Harmon sighed audibly, shaking his head, then waved toward Officer Rodriguez. Fine. Let him call. We don't want any lawsuits over denying a phone call. Charles accepted the phone with a sincere smile that momentarily softened even the officer's professional demeanor. His fingers moved across the keypad with confidence. These were hands that had once held a fishing rod, a shovel, a daughter's tiny hand, and they remained remarkably nimble. The room felt quiet, everyone watching, as if they too were waiting for something unexpected. It's time, Charles said into the phone, his tone serene. Bring the documents. He ended the call and gently handed the phone back to the officer. Turning to face the judge, he stood taller now, no longer stooped, but with a presence that filled the room like an oak tree, standing firm in the wind. Judge Harmon narrowed his eyes. Is that supposed to mean something? What exactly are you trying to pull here? But before he could finish the thought, the courtroom's heavy wooden doors swung open, the sound echoing like thunder on a clear day. All heads turned. A woman entered, tall and poised, wearing a long coat and walking with the authority of someone used to commanding a room. Behind her followed two sharply dressed men holding briefcases. Judge Harmon glared at Charles, his face reddening. He hated interruptions, especially the kind he couldn't control. We're in the middle of a hearing. I haven't issued a ruling. Do you think this is some kind of performance? He snapped. Charles remained steady, no longer defending, just stating a truth. I simply want to ensure that real justice is served, Your Honor. The Assistant District Attorney tried again. Your Honor, I really believe we should consider— No need, Harmon interrupted, voice cutting like glass. Some people only learn when they face real consequences. Mr. Wilson, if you want a performance, then perform. But when this is over, you'll have plenty of time to reflect. Behind bars, Your Honor, Charles said softly but with unshakable certainty. I've said what I needed to say, and I haven't, Harmon snapped back, leaning forward. Let me tell you about the real world. In it, every action has a consequence. People work hard to earn what they have, and they deserve to protect it, without being disturbed by your sentimental nostalgia. His voice thundered through the chamber like a gavel on steel, unyielding, immovable. But in just a moment, everything would shift, and the only person who would remain calm was the one they had all dismissed from the very beginning. People don't want vagrants wandering onto their land because of some naive memory, Judge Harmon said, his voice low and heavy. The word vagrant dropped into the courtroom like a stone into still water, disruptive, unmistakable. Even those who had smiled in contempt just moments before fell silent, realizing a line had just been crossed. Officer Rodriguez stood next to Charles, his jaw tightly clenched, a subtle but unmistakable response for anyone paying close attention. The air in the courtroom was stretched taut, like a string pulled too far. So how exactly do you support yourself, Mr. Wilson? Judge Harmon pressed, on seemingly energized by the heavy silence. Are you on public assistance, living off taxpayer money? Or do you have some undisclosed source of income the court doesn't know about? I am fully capable of supporting myself, Your Honor, Charles responded, his voice as calm as still water, neither defensive nor pleading. Capable? Harmon repeated with biting sarcasm. What a conveniently vague answer. Look at yourself. When was the last time you held a real job? The last time you contributed something meaningful to society instead of being a burden? The room sank into a stifling discomfort. Yet Charles's eyes never wavered from the man seated above, cloaked in a black robe like a looming shadow. I've worked my entire life, sir, he said, his blue eyes locked on Harmon. And I'm still working. In my own way. In your way? Harmon sneered. And what exactly is that? Professional trespasser? A ghost of the past who haunts private property? The young clerk seated near the bench lowered her eyes to her notepad, unwilling to meet anyone's gaze. Even the court reporter had lost her stoic mask, glancing occasionally toward Charles to see if he was still enduring the barrage. I already told you, I spend my time on things that matter to me, Charles repeated, unmoved. Oh, yes, things that matter to you, Harmon mocked, making air quotes. It was no longer a legal proceeding. It had become a monologue, a power display. One man trying to crush another who had nothing left but his dignity. You know what I think? Harmon's voice sharpened. I think you're one of those people who believes the world owes you something. You haven't built anything. You just coast along living off excuses, and now, at the end of your life, you think you can go wherever you want because memory gives you permission? Something flickered in Charles's eyes. Not anger, but a flicker of amusement. A small smile played on his lips before vanishing as quickly as it came. Interesting theory, Your Honor, he said softly. Harmon's face flushed. This is not a game. This is a courtroom. And I am fully prepared to send you to jail for 30 days to teach you the respect for the law that you so clearly lack. His voice echoed under the vaulted ceiling like a hammer striking an anvil. Do you have anything to say before I pass judgment? The room held its breath. Charles inhaled deeply and closed his eyes for a moment of serenity amid the storm. Only this, he said quietly but clearly. Appearances can be deceiving, and judgments made in haste often become regrets that linger. The words, more philosophical than defensive, cast a stillness across the courtroom. For a moment, something shifted in Harmon's face, but he quickly returned to his mask of authority. Empty wisdom, he spat. You think you're some kind of sage? Let me teach you a lesson about reality. Actions have consequences, and the consequence of your behavior is. The courtroom door opened again, but this time, it wasn't a subtle interruption. The heavy wooden doors swung wide with force, and the sharp click of high heels against marble echoed like the cadence of a military drum roll. Every head turned, Even Judge Harmon was forced to pause mid-sentence, irritation flaring across his face as he prepared to reprimand whoever had dared interrupt him at the height of his authority. But then he froze. A woman entered, elegant and composed, wearing a charcoal gray suit tailored to precision. Her eyes were like lasers scanning the room. Every step she took radiated presence and command. This was not someone to be underestimated. Her high heels, bright red and unmistakably designer, recognizable only to those familiar with luxury fashion, clicked rhythmically against the marble floor. Each step was like a summons from a power too strong to ignore. Her jet black hair was slicked back, accentuating sharp cheekbones and icy blue eyes, an exact match to the man standing silently at the defendant's table. Behind her, 3 men in impeccable suits followed closely, each carrying a leather briefcase embossed with the logo of Preston and Hargraves, one of the most prestigious law firms in the country. Their arrival shifted the atmosphere in the courtroom instantly. Like the low pressure before a storm, Judge Harmon took a few seconds to find his voice again. "This court is in session. If you are not directly connected to this case, I must ask you to wait outside." "I am directly connected to this case, Your Honor," the woman replied, her voice calm but commanding, bringing the entire courtroom to a standstill. She didn't slow down as she approached the barrier separating the gallery from the main floor. Officer Rodriguez glanced at the judge, awaiting instructions. Harmon, rattled by her confidence, something he rarely encountered, could only nod slightly. She passed the barrier and walked directly to Charles Wilson, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, a gesture both protective and intimate. When she turned to face the bench, her demeanor remained professional, but a storm of restrained fury simmered behind her eyes. "I am Catherine Wilson, CEO of Wilson Global Technologies," she said, her voice echoing without need for a microphone. "I'm here regarding my father, Charles Wilson, the man you've spent the last 20 minutes publicly humiliating." The courtroom gasped. Like an electric current had jolted through the crowd. Shock rippled in waves. Judge Harmon, who had moments ago stood tall in moral indignation, now paled visibly. "Miss Wilson, this is highly irregular. Court procedure dictates." "I'm well aware of court procedure, Your Honor," Catherine cut in, her tone polite but icy. "I'm also familiar with the Judicial Code of Conduct, which prohibits bias, prejudice, or demeaning treatment of defendants based on perceived socioeconomic status." She tilted her head slightly, voice lowering like a warning. "And all of those have been on gross display in this courtroom today." One of the attorneys behind her stepped forward and placed a leather-bound folder on the defense table. "Ms. Wilson, the documents you requested," he said. Catherine nodded without breaking eye contact with Harmon. "Your Honor, you may want to review these materials before continuing your assessment of my father." Judge Harmon glanced at Catherine, then at Charles, then at the folder, as if it were ticking. His expression collapsed. His once powerful stance eroded into that of a man who realized he might be standing on crumbling ground. "This court will take a 15-minute recess," he declared, though his voice no longer carried command. "Only retreat." "I don't believe that will be necessary," Catherine said flatly. "Unless, of course, you need a few moments to collect yourself after realizing you've just spent the morning berating one of this state's most respected business leaders and philanthropists." A wave of whispers swept across the courtroom like a crashing tide. Judge Harmon slammed his gavel down, but the sound no longer carried the weight of authority. It was a desperate attempt to mask his unraveling composure. Charles Wilson stood silently, his eyes fixed on his daughter with undisguised pride. A faint smile traced his lips, his gaze distant, as if seeing something far beyond the courtroom walls. "Ms. Wilson," Harmon struggled to regain control, his voice now laced with reluctance. I assure you this was simply a misunderstanding. Had I known your father's true identity—" "And that," Catherine cut in sharply, her voice like a honed blade, is exactly the problem. The idea that you would have treated him differently had you known who he was. That's the greatest failure of all. She turned slightly, her gaze sweeping across the room. Her voice was clear and resolute. Now everyone knows who he is. That's why we're all here today. Judge Harmon's confusion deepened. I don't understand. Catherine signaled one of the 3 attorneys behind her. The man opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a small digital recorder, placing it on the defendant's table. With your permission, Your Honor, she said, still perfectly composed. I'd like to play a recording to clarify the true nature of these proceedings. Before Harmon could respond, Charles Wilson, who had remained quiet since his daughter's arrival, finally spoke. But this time his voice was no longer frail or timid. It was firm, commanding, and full of the presence of a man who had once stood before boardrooms and steered decisions that shaped industries. It's time they understood, Catherine, he said, his eyes never leaving the judge. The complete shift in his demeanor caused several people in the courtroom to lean forward, trying to reconcile this composed, powerful figure with the seemingly pitiful old man they had seen just moments earlier. What is this, Mr. Wilson? Harmon asked, his tone lower now, unsure. Charles removed his worn cap, smoothed his hand through his white hair, and stood upright. No trace left of the frail posture from earlier. This is a lesson, Your Honor, for you and for everyone in this courtroom. He nodded to Catherine, who pressed play. A familiar voice filled the room. Judge Harmon's voice, laced with sarcasm and condescension. Look at yourself. Is this how you choose to present yourself to society? There are dozens of places that can help people like you. Each line from the recording sliced through the room like a blade, turning back on the very authority Harmon had once wielded with such pride. His face turned from pale to ashen. With each replayed insult, he seemed to shrink further into his chair. When the recording ended, an absolute silence blanketed the courtroom. Charles stepped forward, his eyes blazing with quiet dignity and self-possession no one could deny. For those who may not recognize my name, he began, his voice steady and strong. I'm the founder of Wilson Global Technologies, established 45 years ago. Before that, I was an engineer with NASA, part of the Apollo program. I hold 16 patents and sit on the boards of 7 Fortune 500 companies. He paused, scanning the room of stunned faces. And yes, I sometimes dress like this. A few jaws dropped. Some phones were subtly raised, recording, not out of curiosity, but with the awareness that they were witnessing a historic moment. For the past 10 years, Charles continued, I've conducted what my daughter calls a social experiment. I wear old clothes, leave behind my ID, and spend 2 weeks living as someone with no resources. I ride buses, eat at shelters, and yes, occasionally return to places from my childhood. Like the Clearwater estate, Judge Harmon looked as if he were witnessing the collapse of his entire legacy. Inside the very courtroom he once ruled. Mr. Wilson, he began weakly. I'm not finished, Your Honor, Charles interrupted, his voice calm but undeniable. Character isn't defined by circumstance. It's revealed by it. When people think I have nothing, no power, no money, no influence, they show me who they really are. Some show compassion. Others, his eyes locked onto Harmon, show contempt. Catherine stepped forward, lifting the recorder. We had a standing agreement, she said, her gaze unwavering. If my father ever encountered true injustice during one of these experiments, he would call me. Today is a clear example of judicial abuse. One of the attorneys handed her another document. Catherine passed it to Officer Rodriguez, who delivered it to the judge. This is a formal notice of our intent to file a complaint with the Judicial Ethics Committee, she announced. It includes the audio recording, the court transcript, and witness statements. Harmon held the document with visibly trembling hands, as if it were the final page of his own career. Miss Wilson, Mr. Wilson, his voice faltered, pathetic. This This was all a misunderstanding." "No, Your Honor," Charles said firmly. "You saw an old man in worn clothes and assumed he had no worth. You used your authority to demean someone you believed couldn't fight back." He turned to the young public defender, the one who had hesitated earlier out of fear. Amina looked around the room. The true measure of justice isn't how it treats the powerful. It's how it treats those who have nothing. "So, what is it you want here, Mr. Wilson?" Harmon asked, clinging to a thread of hope. Catherine answered in her father's place. "Justice, Your Honor. The same justice that every person who walks into this courtroom deserves, regardless of what they wear or how much money they have." The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Only the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway could be heard, its steady rhythm a reminder that time reveals all things. Judge Harmon, once the unquestioned authority in this space, now sat motionless, his face drained of color, the truth laid bare and nowhere left to hide. As the full weight of the situation became clear, Assistant District Attorney Melissa Chin stood abruptly, her expression caught between shock and the dawning recognition of the professional consequences ahead. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "in light of these revelations, the prosecution moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Charles Wilson immediately." Judge Harmon barely managed a nod, as though waking from a fog. His eyes never left Charles, but the judgment was gone, replaced by a stunned silence. "Motion granted," he murmured, the words heavy on his lips, as if each one marked the closing of a door he'd never reopen. Catherine Wilson gave a subtle signal to her attorney. The man stepped forward, handed another document to the court officer, who then brought it to the bench. "We'd like this document entered into the record," Catherine said firmly. The judge took the paper with trembling hands, his brow furrowed as he read its contents. "The property deed?" He looked up, almost in disbelief. "Exactly," Charles confirmed. "I purchased the Clearwater estate 6 months ago through a holding company, so, legally speaking, I wasn't trespassing at all. I was simply visiting my own property without notifying the security staff in advance." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. A few people even laughed, unable to believe what they were witnessing. "You own that entire estate?" Harmon couldn't even finish the sentence. "And the Westbrook Country Club as well, the one you accused me of reoffending on last year," Charles added, calmly straightening the collar of his worn coat with quiet dignity. "Why would you allow yourself to be arrested?" Harmon asked, his voice now stripped of authority. "To understand how this system treats those without money or influence," Charles replied. "To witness firsthand how justice can be obscured by bias, and to make a moment like this possible, one where the truth has no choice but to come to light." Catherine stepped forward, her eyes blazing with purpose. "When my father was building Wilson Global Technologies, he would spend 1 week each year working alongside the janitorial staff. He believed you can only fix a system when you've seen it from every angle." One of the attorneys leaned in and whispered something to her. Catherine nodded, then looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, we have no intention of pursuing legal action against you personally, if you're willing to acknowledge the deeper issues at play here." Harmon exhaled in visible relief, but only for a moment. "However, we will still proceed with filing a complaint to the Judicial Ethics Committee," she continued, her voice expressionless, "because this isn't about one individual. It's about ensuring that every person who enters a courtroom is treated with dignity and presumed innocent until proven otherwise." Charles nodded in agreement. "For every person like me, who has the means to expose the truth, there are thousands who silently endure." The courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers. Some people could no longer resist and began recording the moment on their phones. A few minutes later, a young woman stepped forward from the audience, clutching a notebook tightly, her face a mix of nerves and resolve. "Mr. Wilson, Miss Wilson," she said softly, "I'm Sarah Patel, a third-year law student, currently clerking under Judge Harmon." She glanced back at the judge's bench, where Harmon was pretending to read a file. "What you've done today, it really matters," Sarah said, her voice shaky but full of conviction. "Because what you exposed? It's not unusual. It's how he treats defendants who are poor, who don't speak English, who don't have private attorneys, and no one ever says anything." Charles looked at her with gentle eyes. "Thank you, Ms. Patel. Speaking truth to power is never easy, but it's always the right thing to do." Just as father and daughter were about to leave the courtroom, a court officer entered hurriedly through the side door, carrying a tablet. He showed it to Judge Harmon, whose face turned pale as he scanned the screen. "Mr. Wilson." His voice was hoarse. "News of today's events has already spread on social media. There's a crowd of reporters gathering outside the courthouse." Charles turned to Catherine, who nodded. "The courthouse lobby is packed, Dad." "The age of technology, Your Honor," Charles said, his eyes sharp with clarity. "Back in the day, news traveled by print. Now it moves faster than light." He turned back to the judge, now just a shell of the man he had been. "Your Honor," Charles said gently, "I have a proposal." Armand sat upright, clinging to a flicker of hope. "I'm listening. Step outside with us. Tell the truth. Acknowledge what happened, and commit to being part of the solution. Not for me, but for those who've never had the chance to be heard." Charles Wilson's face radiated sincerity. No trace of anger or vengeance. His voice was warm and resolute as he addressed the judge, who still sat stunned. "Don't view this as a disgrace," he said softly. "See it as an opportunity, not to be ruined, but to grow." The crowd fell silent. Harmon looked frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief as he stared at the man he had dismissed just hours earlier as a worthless vagrant. "You want me to face the press after everything that's happened?" Harmon asked, his voice trembling with despair. "Precisely because of what's happened, you should," Charles replied. "Public failures, if we're brave enough to face them, can become powerful catalysts for real change." Catherine stood beside her father, looking at him with a mix of surprise and admiration. Throughout the meticulous planning of this social experiment, he had never once mentioned offering redemption to the man who had humiliated him. But that was Charles Wilson, a man who believed that compassion didn't weaken strength, it magnified it. The news spread like wildfire. Within 10 minutes, the halls of the Jefferson County Courthouse were abuzz with movement. Attorneys abandoned consultations, clerks left their desks, even custodial staff paused their duties to follow the growing crowd. Charles, Catherine, and Judge Harmon, now no longer a symbol of power but a man struggling to reclaim his integrity, walked together toward the courthouse's grand wooden doors. The black robe on Harmon's shoulders no longer symbolized authority. It now felt like mourning cloth for a conscience awakened too late. "Are you sure about this?" Catherine whispered as they neared the exit. "He doesn't deserve forgiveness," she added, her eyes still burning with unresolved anger. "He humiliated you. He was ready to send you to jail without blinking." Charles gently squeezed his daughter's hand, his voice soft but unwavering. "This was never about one man, Catherine. It's about a system that needs changing. Revenge offers fleeting satisfaction, but forgiveness, it transforms the soul." The doors swung open. Outside, a sea of people waited. Reporters packed shoulder to shoulder, cameras raised high, questions shouted into the air like a downpour, flashbulbs fired relentlessly. Names were called out loud and fast. "Mr. Wilson," and then Charles raised his hand. Just one gesture, simple, calm, but powerful, was enough to silence the crowd instantly. It was the mark of a true leader, the composed presence of a man who had once led an empire. Now he used that presence to lead something greater. "Justice. Thank you all for being here," he began. No microphones, no loudspeakers, just a voice shaped by conviction and lived experience. "I'm Charles Wilson, founder of Wilson Global Technologies." A wave of astonishment swept through the crowd. The connection was made. They were standing in front of one of the most influential men in America. Today, I appeared in this courtroom not because I was forced to, but because I chose to, he said, gesturing to the worn clothes he wore. For the past 10 years, twice a year, I've stepped away from my privileges to live as an ordinary person. Sometimes as someone poor, someone forgotten, someone voiceless. This morning in courtroom 7, I witnessed something far too common. Across this country, people aren't judged by their character, but by their clothing. Not by the facts, but by the weight of their wallet. The air was thick with emotion, as if it might burst under the weight of what was being said. Catherine stood beside her father, proud. Judge Harmon stood nearby, his robe fluttering in the wind, looking small for the first time. But today, Charles continued, we also have an opportunity to start changing things. He turned and extended a hand toward Judge Harmon. Has agreed to face this with me. Not because I demanded it, but because he understands that admitting our mistakes is the first step to real change. The crowd held its breath. Harmon hesitated. Then, like a man stepping out of a long fall, he moved forward. His hand met Charles's. Not out of status, but truth. I was wrong, he said. His voice trembled, but he didn't shy away. I forgot the most basic principle of justice, that everyone who walks into a courtroom deserves to be treated with respect. The entire plaza seemed to hold still, and then, in the middle of the whirlwind of cameras, lights, and social media, silence was replaced by something miraculous. Hope. Judge Harmon's voice rose again, for the first time without command or authority, but with truth. I let prejudice cloud my judgment, and in doing so, I betrayed the oath I took as a judge. He looked up at Charles Wilson, his eyes no longer those of a man seated above others, but of someone relearning the first lesson of justice. I offer my sincere apology to you, and more importantly, to everyone who has stood before me and received less than true justice. Charles gave a slight nod. His face was solemn, not prideful, only marked by the understanding of a man who had lived through both glory and abandonment. I will be requesting a leave of absence to cooperate with any investigation from the Judicial Ethics Committee, Harmon continued, his voice growing steadier. I also commit to undergoing implicit bias training and working with justice reform organizations. A reporter pushed forward, skeptical. Your Honor, are you saying this because you mean it, or because you got caught? Judge Harmon paused. He looked at Charles, who neither offered rescue nor condemnation, and in that moment he understood that every eye was waiting on his choice, to run or to face the truth. I'm saying it because today, for the first time in my life, I saw myself through someone else's eyes, and I didn't like what I saw. Charles stepped forward, his eyes gleaming, not with victory, but with hope. Acknowledgement is the first step toward change, he said. I didn't do all of this to shame one man. I did it for the thousands who walk into courtrooms every day with no money, no lawyer, and no one to stand with them. Catherine stood beside him and declared, Wilson Global Technologies will establish the Equal Justice Fund with an initial commitment of $50 million. 0 cents. A murmur rippled through the crowd. This fund will provide legal representation for the underprivileged, advocate for judicial reform, and help create an independent review system for cases involving unfair rulings. Charles spotted Sarah Patel, the young law student who had bravely spoken out, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd. He invited her forward. This is Sarah Patel, a young woman who had the courage to speak truth to power. She will be the first recipient of the fund's fellowship. All eyes turned to Sarah, who stood frozen for a moment, barely able to believe what was happening. But her eyes no longer wavered. In just 3 months, she had changed. Judge Harmon leaned into Charles and asked quietly, "Why did you do this? You could have destroyed me, and instead you gave me a chance." Charles looked at him, voice steady with wisdom. Because this was never about you. It's about the thousands who've never had the chance to stand where I did today. If your public accountability can spark systemic change, even a little, then it was all worth it. Harmon nodded slowly, like a man relearning how to walk. I never saw them. All those people. All these years. Now I do. And the question is, Charles said as he turned away, what will you do with that awareness? Sensing her father tiring, Catherine stepped forward to close the press event. Thank you all for being here. A formal press conference will be held next week to announce more details about the Equal Justice Fund. Charles's legal team surrounded him, guiding him toward the black town car waiting at the curb, a sharp contrast to the public bus he had arrived in that morning. As he reached the door, he paused and turned back toward the courthouse steps. Judge Harmon still stood there, alone, his robe catching the wind, like a man just waking from a long dream. Their eyes met. No words, just a subtle nod, and something unspoken passed between them. Forgiveness, awakening, and a new beginning. 3 months later, in his high-rise office atop a gleaming glass tower, Charles Wilson sat at a mahogany desk. He wore a deep navy suit, custom-tailored, and his silver hair was neatly trimmed. Spread across his desk were that morning's newspapers, all bearing the same front-page headline, Charles Wilson Equal Justice Act signed into law. Catherine walked in, tablet in hand, her voice filled with pride. It's official, Dad. As of today, courtroom procedures across the entire state will change. Charles smiled, lifting one of the papers. It's incredible what can happen in just 3 months. When you've got a viral video, public outrage, and $50 million 0 cents behind you, Catherine teased, settling into the seat across from him. The new law didn't just introduce higher standards for judicial ethics. It mandated implicit bias training and created an independent oversight system. Perhaps most remarkable of all, it had passed, with unprecedented speed, in a legislature known for gridlock. And the scholarship program? Charles asked, changing the subject. Catherine swiped quickly through her tablet. Over 500 law students have applied. Sarah's leading the selection committee. She's doing an outstanding job. Charles nodded with satisfaction. Sarah Patel, the final year law student from that day in court, had become a new face of justice reform. Once standing quietly in the shadows, she was now a leader, propelled by courage and belief in change. And our special guest today? Charles glanced at the clock, waiting in the conference room as scheduled. Catherine replied, her voice lower, tinged with anticipation, and perhaps forgiveness. Catherine still wasn't entirely comfortable. She looked at her father, speaking softly but with clear uncertainty. I still don't get it, Dad. Why are you giving him a platform to speak? Charles smiled, adjusting his tie. Because sometimes the most powerful voices for change come from those who've most clearly experienced the need for it. Catherine shook her head, smiling faintly. You're always playing chess, Dad. Thinking 3 moves ahead. 4, if you're counting right, Charles said with a familiar twinkle in his eye. The executive conference room at the top of Wilson Global Technologies remained as imposing as ever. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows offering panoramic views of the sunlit city, and a long walnut table polished to perfection. Meant to seat 20, but today it held only 2. Richard Harmon stood as Charles entered. His judge's robe had been replaced by a simple gray suit. While his appearance was familiar, his eyes held something new, a humility that hadn't been there before. Mr. Wilson, Harmon greeted, extending his hand. Call me Charles, he replied, shaking hands warmly. We're not on opposite sides anymore, are we? They sat down, Charles at the head of the table, Harmon to his right. Harmon tapped a folder beside him. I received the invitation to join the advisory board. Honestly, I'm not sure I deserve it. Charles tilted his head, watching him closely. You used to represent the flaws in the system. Who better to recognize them and help us fix them? Harmon paused, then nodded slowly. Fair. But some might say you should have chosen someone with a cleaner history. Second chances are the most powerful thing we can offer, Charles said, not just for the person who receives them, but for everyone who sees it happen. They sat in silence for a moment, sharing a contemplative air. Harmon looked out the window, sunlight casting golden reflections on the city below. These past 3 months have felt like a crash course in humanity. 15 years on the bench, and now I'm just another citizen. Humility, it's a feeling I'd never known so deeply before. That's exactly what I hoped you'd learn, Charles replied gently. After a pause, Harmon spoke again. You know, I've handed down sentences to hundreds. Jail time, probation, community service. But you sentenced me to something far more profound. And what do you think that sentence was? Charles asked, his tone soft. Awareness. The inability to hide behind my own bias again. Seeing myself through someone else's eyes. It's harsher than any sentence I ever passed down, but also more forgiving. Charles nodded. The most effective justice isn't punitive. It's transformative. Once again, a silence passed between them. Not heavy, but filled with mutual understanding. There's one thing I've always wondered, Harmon said, his voice lower now. When you stood before me in those ragged clothes, knowing you could destroy me with one phone call, did you hate me? Charles considered this for a moment. Oh, I wasn't angry. I didn't hate you. I was disappointed. Not just in you, but in a system that rewards that kind of treatment of people. He looked Harmon straight in the eye. Hate blinds us. I needed clarity to turn that moment into meaningful change. Harmon nodded. A final lesson. Perhaps the most important one. True power, Charles said, rising from his chair, isn't in your title. It's in how you treat other people. They parted ways. Catherine entered with a list of media appointments and press requests, but Charles barely glanced at them. I need to make a stop before the press conference, he told her. Have James bring the car around. 1 hour later, Charles Wilson stood on the newly restored fishing pier at Clearwater. The water was still, the sky clear, and the air carried the scent of fresh-cut wood. He had changed out of his suit into jeans and a flannel shirt. Not to play a part, but simply for comfort. This was where it all began, where he had once been handcuffed for trespassing. Now, it was a symbol of a turning point. Footsteps creaked across the wooden planks behind him. What are you doing out here? Catherine asked, surprised. The press conference starts in an hour. Charles smiled, pointing toward an old bench near the lake's edge. When I was young, every Sunday, your grandfather and I would fish there. On that bench, he taught me something I've never forgotten. What was that? Catherine asked softly, joining him at the railing, eyes following the ripples on the water. The true worth of a person, Charles said slowly, isn't found in their wealth or title, but in how they treat those who can offer them nothing in return. Catherine wrapped her arm around her father's and rested her head on his shoulder. That's why you bought this place? Because of the memories? In part, Charles replied. But more than that, it's a reminder. After all these years building a company and creating technology, nothing has ever made me feel more alive than what we've done in the past 3 months. Because it was personal? Catherine asked. Charles gently shook his head, his eyes still on the lake glowing with the colors of dusk. No, because it mattered to society. Technology changes how we live. But justice, it changes who we are. They turned to walk away from the pier. Charles glanced back one last time. The lake was still, the surface barely rippled, but from that very stillness, a wave had been set in motion. That wave wouldn't stop with a single judge. It would reach every person, every courtroom, every shadowed corner of the legal system. To remind everyone of this, dignity isn't found in appearances but in how we treat one another, especially when no one's watching.